we move on to have another presentation by Erik Olson. Erik Olson, we're very lucky to have Erik here. He not only runs the food program at the Pew Foundation, but has a long history of dealing with agriculture and with environmental issues in the Senate, where he was for 17 years or some time.
A few years.
A few. And where he made a really well-placed person in the Senate can make a huge difference. And Erik was in that position and lucky enough to be able to do that. He started his environmental learning as an undergraduate at Columbia and went on to the University of Virginia Law School. So Erik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is there a slide changer?
I think it's over there.
Well, thank you. You'll hear some echoes of what Lester was saying. I'm going to talk primarily about domestic food and biofuels issues, but you'll hear many echoes of what Lester was talking about. Just an introduction to the Pew Charitable Trusts. We do actually take positions and advocacy positions. It is unlike a lot of foundations because we've converted to a nonprofit charitable organization now. So we do take science-based policies. We tend towards pragmatic and effective solutions that are based on involving a lot of stakeholders. And I'll just caveat this because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on my experience in the Senate and in the nonprofit world. And some of it is not based on Pew policy, so bear with me. Just a little bit of history of why we are where we are. There is a long history of congressional incentives for biofuels. These include the so-called Renewable Fuel Standard. There's 2 rounds, RFS 1 and RFS 2. Historically, the vast majority of biofuels have been based on corn ethanol with emerging more soy biodiesel. But the way that RFS 2, the more recent version, is structured, it's intended to encourage cellulosic biofuels. And I'll talk about that a little more later, but it's encouraging a move away from corn and soy biofuels. There's a long history of tax incentives that I won't go into because I think most of you would fall asleep, but there have been several tax incentives that actually have gone the way of the dinosaur. Some of them are still being debated, but I think that there will be additional pressure on those, as well as on the trade and tariffs that have been intended to encourage domestic biofuel production. In addition, what a lot of folks haven't focused on is a lot of states also have incentives for ethanol and other biofuels, primarily ethanol, about 40 states. And of course, both the EU and Brazil and some other major global players also have strong positions to try to encourage biofuel production. So the obvious question, and the one that's very hard to answer, is what is the impact of biofuel production been on food prices? I think there's general consensus that it has had an impact and has caused increases. This chart is the NASS chart on average monthly corn farm prices, prices at the farm from 2000 till the present. And what you'll see is pretty clearly a spike in prices starting around 2006. It really started going up for corn. Obviously, biofuels was part of that mix, but there have also been tight commodity markets broadly, increasing global population, as Lester mentioned, and increased meat consumption. The U.S. dollar clearly has some impact on it, as well as some energy price increases. The actual impact of the RFS, specifically on corn and soybean prices, has been fairly controversial, but I think that an estimate that was used in doing some projections by the National Research Council in a report that came out in 2011 was that they used for purposes of analysis an estimate that about 20 to 40% of commodity price increases in 2007, 2008 were related to biofuel policy, specifically to the RFS most likely. Obviously, additional contributors, as Lester had mentioned, is the worst U.S. drought that we've had in decades, and extreme weather. Obviously, climate change is real, and we're seeing it. It's certainly having effects on yield as well as on prices, increasing prices. And obviously, there are global impacts as well. Lester mentioned what's going on in China. There are clearly the Russian wheat crop failure from a couple of years ago and ongoing problems. So there are a series of clear implications of climate change on prices as well. Now, Lester may have more recent information, but about 40% of the U.S. corn supply has gone to ethanol. Some of that goes to what's called DDGS, or dried distilled grains with solubles. These are fed to livestock, so it would be slightly lower than that actually of the value. On the global market, similarly, there's a lot of global corn that's going to ethanol. Obviously, in Brazil, a lot of sugarcane. Soybeans are a major biodiesel source in the U.S., and obviously, by some estimates, to see that 14% this year, or last year, of soy acres went to biodiesel, that suggests that there's starting to be pretty significant impacts. Ultimately, impacts on food, you really have to take a look at. Now, there's a difference between the wholesale global crop prices and U.S. retail food prices. And the reason for that is fairly obvious. U.S. consumption is not so much, as Lester was saying, most Americans do not take grain and make from scratch food. We mostly consume processed foods like cornflakes. And the percentage of the cornflake box, the amount of money in your box of cornflakes that goes to the actual corn is relatively small. Same with most processed foods. So the impact of price increases on U.S. food is somewhat muted by that fact. But clearly, grocery manufacturers and others have been quite concerned about biofuels because of the implications for prices. The biofuels industry obviously has taken issue with some of the projections that have been put out, but I think there is fairly broad agreement that at least there is some substantial impact on the actual commodity prices, and therefore there is some impact on retail prices, but the exact prices we could spend an entire seminar debating. The contribution of corn and soy, again, you've got to really look at the so-called marketing margin. I would commend to you the NRC report that really rolled up, the committee rolled up its sleeves and really tried to take a hard look at that. It's complex, but as I was saying clearly, in the U.S., it's quite a different story than what you see in developing countries, where the price increases have had profound impacts in countries, as Lester was saying, where people are eating directly some of these commodities like corn or soybeans. In addition, obviously there are major health and environmental issues that need to be considered as we move towards additional use of biofuels. Clearly, for corn and soybeans, there are pesticide and fertilizer use that must be considered, runoff issues. Increasingly with the price of corn, as you've seen, there is increasing pressure on conversion of marginal farmlands, maybe even forests in some places, to crops. In addition, there are questions about, if you take a hard look at the life cycle analysis, how much greenhouse gas improvement do you actually get from corn and soybeans, for example. Again, a fair amount of debate, obviously, at least with current methods and the more modern systems, you get some greenhouse gas improvement. Exactly how much is debated. Clearly, water use is a major issue. And then another issue that needs to be considered is what are the health effects of a heavy processed food, corn-based and soybean-based diet. That's something that's not talked about a lot, but I'll just advertise that IOM, the food panel of IOM, is going to be taking a look at this issue, the relationship between sustainable diets and the healthfulness of the diet. And I think obviously biofuels have to be part of that mix. So this takes us to advanced biofuels, and there was a question about algae. There are clearly some other methods to produce biofuels than using corn or soybeans or sugarcane. Some of these include cellulosic biofuels, which is what the RFS is trying to move the system towards, sawgrass and switchgrass, short rotation woody crops, and so on. I understand there was some discussion of this yesterday. Agricultural and industrial waste biogas have some promise, but I think the algae is really starting to look interesting. There are some so-called drop-in technologies, which basically means you don't have to completely change all the infrastructure. You may be able to simply substitute some of these biofuels directly for gasoline or for petroleum-based fuels without major changes in infrastructure, which would obviously save quite a bit of technology as well as resources. Obviously, there are benefits to these more advanced biofuels, including greenhouse gas reduction. Obviously, the relative lack of impact on food crop prices and on food crops generally, as well as land use, lower fertilizer and pesticide use. The water, especially for some of these perennials, is much lower, and then there are fewer land impacts. So I guess what I'd like to wrap up with and leave some time for discussion is that some of these advanced biofuels offer promise. Certainly, one option is to go the direction of the electric car. There will be certainly, for some time, we'll be continuing to use liquid fuels, I think. And I think moving towards the more advanced biofuels offers some promise. You can reduce the impact on food prices, certainly reduce the impact on environment and health, potentially have greenhouse gas benefits of far more significance, and some national security benefits by shifting away from some of the heavy reliance on petroleum-based fuels that are coming in from overseas in fairly volatile regions. There are obviously some pretty significant challenges that remain. In addition to the environmental challenges, there are technological challenges with the shift. Certainly the cellulosic biofuel industry has not taken off the way many people thought it would. There are timing problems because just getting a major shift of the U.S. fuel supply over to advanced biofuels is going to take some time unless there's a complete change in the way that we do business, which is what Lester is arguing for. And certainly the infrastructure challenges are very significant with trying to shift us to that point. So I'd be happy to take some questions and have some discussion.
Erik,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.